Shadow the Hedgehog, canonically, may in fact be the strongest entity in the entire Sonic universe. This is a pretty bold claim, I know. Yeah, he's got some nifty chaos control abilities and can turn super, but come on, he can't be that strong, right? Sure, he's no pushover, but he's been shown to be bested by Sonic on multiple occasions. Well, what if I told you that the games have only just scratched the surface of Shadow's true potential? Shadow's limiter rings, worn around his wrists and ankles, wall him off from harnessing his full potential. Without them, he'd honestly be too dangerous for anyone to handle, even himself. So what exactly are limiter rings? What do they do? How do they do it? And why exactly does Shadow even need them in the first place? Welcome to Chaomix, and this is the fascinating lore of Shadow's limiter rings. Shadow is extremely powerful by himself, but we rarely see his true, full potential. Only when pushed against a wall where his limits are tested does he reveal his ultimate trump card. Shadow is able to take off his limiter rings, each one lifting the restrictions to his strength and uncovering explosive power. This is such a risky move because doing so expends his energy rapidly that we only see it a small handful of times over the course of the entire series. So where exactly do we see the limiter rings come into play? Well, of course, Shadow is first introduced in Sonic Adventure 2. And as soon as he's revealed, we can see these limiter rings around his wrists and ankles, resembling the iconic gold rings found throughout the regular levels of each game. Something unique to Sonic Adventure 2 though, that I always found pretty amusing, is that the design of the limiter rings is actually a bit different than how they're depicted in every other game after this one. While in other games, Shadow's limiter rings perfectly resemble regular rings, the ones in Sonic Adventure 2 have some extra details. First, we can see an indentation or seam that cuts down. Kinda looks like this is where they deattach for Shadow to take them off. Also, we can see this strange flap hanging off the side. It's almost as if Shadow curls them around his wrists, like a slap bracelet. But anyways, the limiter rings in this game aren't really established to be or do anything at this point. They're pretty much just decoration. However, they do actually play an impactful part in the story at the end of the game. But just like Shadow's limiter rings, I can bet you one thing. Your balls are being limited by your terrible generic electric razor. That's why this video is made possible by today's sponsor, Manscaped, the global men's lifestyle brand that's taking men's grooming to the ultimate level. Just like Shadow, you can unlock your hidden potential with the Perfect Package 5.0 Ultra, featuring the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra electric trimmer. This baby comes with a dual skin-safe blade heads, an upgraded trimmer blade, and a foil blade for precision grooming. The Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra features a bigger LED light and a dual temperature setting, USB-C charging, a 3-level battery indicator, RPM technology, travel lock, and it's still waterproof. And elevate your self-care routine with the Crop Soother and Crop Preserver. The Crop Soother, packed with colloidal oats, shea butter, and cocoa seed butter, keeps your sensitive areas moisturized and soothed. And the Crop Preserver ball deodorant? Say goodbye to funk and hello to freshness all day long. And finally, here's the cherry on top. When you get the Perfect Package 5.0 Ultra, you'll also receive the Manscaped Shed 2.0 travel bag for free. Join the 10 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped for their grooming needs. That's a whopping 20 million balls if my math is correct. Head over to manscaped.com and use code CHAOMIX for 20% off with free international shipping and a free gift. Huge thank you to Manscaped for sponsoring today's video. At the end of Sonic Adventure 2, where Super Sonic and Super Shadow use one last chaos control to warp the space colony Ark off its collision course towards Earth, Shadow uses the last of his energy to ensure their victory. But doing so leads him to exhaustion, and he plummets towards Earth, presumed to be dead. Sonic returns to the Ark with one of his limiter rings in hand, the only thing that Sonic could salvage from the situation, and gives it to Rouge as something to remember him by. Now again, these rings were never established to do anything special at this point in the series, but I can't help but wonder, did Shadow end up removing one in order to muster up enough strength to do that last chaos control? Is that why one of these were left floating in space for Sonic to pick up? I mean, it would explain why he was left exhausted at the end where Sonic wasn't. Maybe Shadow knew that there wouldn't be enough chaos energy between both him and Sonic to perform such a large feat, teleporting the entirety of the space colony Ark, that is. And the only way to actually do so would be to remove one of his limiter rings to unlock that extra bit of energy. And actually, while I was making this video, the official Sonic social media posted a nice little Shadow lore recap video that said something very interesting.
Second item of note. Shadow's limiter rings. When he takes them off, oh boy, he's virtually unstoppable for a short time. Perhaps I can trick him into overexerting himself.
If this doesn't directly imply that Shadow exhausted himself from removing his one inhibitor ring, I just don't know what to tell you. But even if you aren't convinced, the adaptation of Sonic Adventure 2's story in Sonic X just straight up does the story like that. Yes, Sonic X is technically its own separate continuity, but at the very least, this shows that they had the same idea here. Right before Super Sonic and Shadow use Chaos Control, Shadow does in fact take off all 4 of his limiter rings on screen. Sonic and Shadow then combine their power to perform the final Chaos Control to put the Ark off its collision course towards Earth. And because Shadow had spent all of his unlocked energy by removing all of his limits, it makes perfect sense why he would be exhausted after this. And it definitely helps explain how Sonic managed to find one of these rings to bring back with him at the end of the story. But this isn't the only time Shadow unleashes his full potential in Sonic X by removing his limiter rings. In the third and final season of the anime, Shadow returns after his supposed death from the Bio-Lizard fight. And since Chris has been holding on to his limiter rings since, he makes his reappearance without them. Shadow reawakens and uses Chaos Control to steal the emerald from Sonic and company, then warps back to Eggman and Rouge and faints due to exhaustion. Shadow goes around for a hot second without his limiter ring, and even exhausts himself during a battle against a Meteorite ship because of this. But eventually, Chris gives him his limiter rings back when they next encounter. Another time Shadow removes his limiter rings is after the death of the character Molly. In order to avenge her death and push back an armada of Meteorite ships, Shadow removes his limiter rings and uses his upped power to fight back. There's also a scene in Shadow's fight against Knuckles in the episode where he breaks into the X-Tornado to kill Cosmo, where he performs a spin dash and they just kind of end up being off. I guess this implies that he took them off during his spin dash to make it more powerful. Anyways, we get to see one more instance of Shadow removing his limiter rings in Sonic X in the last episode of the series. As Super Sonic and Super Shadow once again join forces to put a stop to the final form of the main villain, they begin to realize that defeating the enemy would cause an explosion that would kill anyone in proximity. So Shadow makes the decision to sacrifice himself for the cause. He quickly incapacitates Sonic, who would have tried to stop him, and takes off his limiter rings once again to perform the insanely large-scale warp all by himself. Spending all of his remaining energy at once, he uses Chaos Control to warp himself and the enemy as far away as possible. And in the far, far distance, we can see a glimmer of light, the galaxy-ending explosion that Shadow had saved everyone from. So getting back on track to the main continuity, after Shadow's apparent death at the end of Sonic Adventure 2, we know that Eggman retrieves his body and restores Shadow back to health in Sonic Heroes. Shadow never quite uses his limiter rings in this game. However, I think it's worth pointing out that the design of his limiter rings from this game forward take on the appearance of regular rings. Unlike Sonic Adventure 2's design, these rings have no indentation or slap bracelet-like flap that hangs off the edge. These are pretty much identical to the rings you'd find throughout the stages of each game from here on out. Another thing I'd like to point out is the Shadow androids we see at the end of Sonic Heroes and Shadow the Hedgehog are also designed with limiter rings. However, it's never really stated if these are just for show or have the same utility that Shadows do. Mephiles from Sonic 06, when taking on the form of Shadow, is also shown to have these limiter rings. But because he's merely mimicking Shadow's appearance here, I think it's safe to say that these rings don't have actual functionality like Shadow's do. Speaking of Sonic 06, this game is the first and actually only time in the in-game continuity that we explicitly see Shadow remove his limiter rings. During Shadow's fight against the swarm of Mephiles clones, Shadow removes both of his limiter rings on his wrists. This creates an impenetrable field of energy around Shadow that allows him to shred through the horde of clones with ease. But I'd like to point out that Shadow only removes the limiter rings on his wrists. We see both times in Sonic X that the rings around his ankles are also removable and unlock even more power. So I think it's safe to say that Shadow has even more dormant power he has yet to tap into. Plus, we've never seen Shadow use them while in his super form like how we've seen in Sonic X. Now, these may be non-canon, but Shadow does take off his limiter rings, or as they're known here as the inhibitor rings, in the Sonic Archie comic series. The first time would be in Sonic issue 182. During Shadow's fight against Enerjack Knuckles, he removes both limiter rings to perform a powerful Chaos Blast, and then proceeds to get his ass beat and exhaust himself of all his energy. Great job, Shadow, really making these things absolutely useless. The second time would be in Sonic Universe issue 2. Shadow takes them off to give him enough energy to quickly stop Eggman's Doom Laser by warping the laser blast itself away. But after a chaos control, Shadow is brought to exhaustion and almost plummets towards Earth once again. But at the last second, Sonic thankfully catches him. Don't want a repeat of that whole scenario from SA2 again, do we? Something really funny I noticed though is that Shadow is inconsistently drawn with his limiter rings back on in the panels of him plummeting down towards Earth, but in the last two panels they revert back to being off like they should be. Whoopsies. And the third time would be in Sonic Universe issue 63. During Shadow's fight against a Black Arms member known as Black Death, Shadow removes his limiter rings to win a one-on-one fight against the evil alien. Thankfully, he's able to quickly defeat him and put his limiter rings back on before he reaches exhaustion. And that's it for the Sonic Archie comics. But something worth noting is that the limiter rings have yet to be used in the newer Sonic IDW comic series. There's some evidence online saying that Ian Flynn has stated that he wanted to use them in a certain scenario, but Sega told him no. Honestly, this might be for the best. You wouldn't want to dilute their usage like Archie did. And I mean, they aren't even used in the games all that much, it's literally only the one time. I personally think for something like this, less is more, because overusing them kind of starts treading into the realm of the next tier power-up trope that we all know Sonic Team tries to avoid as much as possible. So what exactly are the limiter rings and why does Shadow even need them? Come on, this wouldn't be a chaomix video if we didn't talk about the lore implications. Well, Shadow the Hedgehog, the ultimate life form, was created with the innate ability to efficiently harness the power of chaos energy. Like the failed prototype before him, the Bio Lizard, Shadow's organs were designed to naturally produce and store chaos energy within his body. This energy allows Shadow to execute his signature chaos control abilities, such as Chaos Snap, Chaos Spear, and Chaos Blast. These moves are already insanely powerful by themselves, but their powers are exponentially amplified by Chaos Emeralds. Although Chaos Emeralds are not actually required to use them. Sure, typically Shadow does happen to have an emerald on hand when using one of these techniques, but there are a few examples of Shadow using Chaos Control without a Chaos Emerald. It seems that as long as the user has enough Chaos energy stored within them, they can perform Chaos Control. Whether that energy is generated from a Chaos Emerald, their own organs, or something else. One theory I had, which I explained in great detail in a previous video I did talking about the lore of the rings, is that characters can also collect these rings to build up chaos energy. We can see this as demonstrated in the multiplayer mode of Sonic Adventure 2, where Sonic and Shadow can gather a certain amount of rings to perform chaos control abilities. I theorized that the rings are actually byproducts of the Chaos Emeralds that contain small amounts of chaos energy, able to be spent in a single use for something like these chaos control abilities. It really makes a lot of sense when you think about it. The rings have always had a direct connection to the Chaos Emeralds. After all, rings are used to enter the special stages. They're used as fuel to maintain super states. But one of their most interesting uses, and the topic of today's video, is that they can even be used as limiters to suppress the usage of chaos energy. Shadow, as we've discussed, is one such character that uses rings to limit his chaos energy output. But why would someone like Shadow, the ultimate life form, need for his power to be suppressed? Why would his creator, Gerald Robotnik, purposely prevent Shadow from being at his most powerful state? Well, Shadow being artificially created by Gerald Robotnik does in fact seem to have been built with a very similar flaw to his predecessors: the excess expenditure of chaos energy. Gerald seems to have a tendency to create or tamper with artificial life forms that innately expend an enormous amount of chaos energy, which historically has led them to going berserk. See the Bio Lizard and Emerald as examples. Both lacked an adequate limiter to suppress their spendage of chaos energy and led them to, well, chaos. Chaos energy is extremely powerful, but its potency is a double-edged sword. Too much of it without any sort of top limit can yield something uncontrollable and dangerous. In both of these cases, Gerald did attempt to use specialized machinery in order to suppress their usage of chaos energy, but no machine could truly harness this unwieldy power. But why is that? Well, I think it has to do with the ancient Echidna prayer. The servers are the 7 chaos. Chaos is power. Power enriched by the heart. The controller is the one that unifies the chaos. So it seems that controlling chaos relies on heart or emotion, something that machinery can never truly replicate. It's why the machinery on the Bio Lizard wasn't sufficient enough to control his rage, and why Emerald, despite being injected with a soul and programmed with a failsafe, still went berserk at the end of Sonic Battle. The limiters on both experiments would eventually fail and lead them to lose control, overwhelmed with a surplus of chaos energy. And listen, I don't even think it's Gerald's fault. After all, controlling chaos is an oxymoron. I mean, by definition, chaos is the opposite of control. But attempting to use machinery to control chaos is only one of the reasons why the previous experiments didn't work. How does one control chaos anyways? There are very few entities in the Sonic universe that can control chaos without overtly adverse side effects, with Hedgehogs being some of the select few with an affinity towards it. It's why Shadow was based off of the supercharged Hedgehog in the Angel Island mural, foreshadowing Supersonic. It's unclear what exactly makes it this way, but Hedgehogs are just built different in the Sonic universe, I guess. But unlike characters such as Sonic and even Silver, Shadow isn't just a hedgehog. He's an artificial life form based off of a hedgehog. The thing that truly sets him apart from the other hedgehogs is the Black Arms DNA he was created with. During Shadow's creation, Black Doom, the leader of the Black Arms alien race, made a deal with Gerald Robotnik. The professor would be able to use his DNA in his Project Shadow experiment, but only if this new life form would retrieve the Chaos Emeralds for them 50 years later. Gerald agreed to this deal, even if he planned on secretly sabotaging them from beyond the grave all those years later. But this is another reason Shadow is especially proficient at chaos control, since we can see Black Arms members such as Black Doom himself pulling off some pretty incredible feats with this technique. It's worth noting though that one doesn't need Black Arms DNA to use chaos control. Obviously, we see plenty of other characters without the DNA use it, like Sonic and even the Bio Lizard. But the Black Arms DNA, combined with having organs designed to produce chaos energy, combined also with him being a hedgehog, makes Shadow an absolute powerhouse when it comes to producing and manipulating chaos energy. However, even with all of this, we still have the problem of managing the overflow of chaos energy, just like the failed experiments to come before him. This is where the limiter rings come into play. Yes, the very rings that Shadow wears around his wrists and ankles. His limiter rings are used specifically to suppress his chaos energy. Just like how regular rings found throughout the overworld can store chaos energy, these limiter rings also seem to be able to hold on to chaos energy in a unique way. But instead of simply storing this energy, they act as a sort of filter, making it so that the wearer channels their chaos energy through these rings and funnels the output so it isn't as explosive. Because the excess use of chaos energy, while powerful, is extremely inefficient. Without the rings, yes, Shadow would be insanely powerful, but he would exhaust himself way too quickly. This is why the few times we actually see Shadow take off these limiter rings, it's only as a last-ditch effort. And using rings is truly the only way to limit chaos energy, because unlike the machinery used to attempt to control chaos energy before, rings seem to be byproducts of chaos emeralds themselves. And just like the Echidna prayers say, chaos energy can be controlled from the heart through the power of the chaos emeralds. At least that's how I see it. Shadow's limiter rings have always been here, teasing us with the insane potential of Shadow's true power. While I'm glad him removing them isn't overused, I do think it's about time we make them relevant again. After all, we've only ever seen him remove them one time all the way back in Sonic 06, and that was just the 2 rings. So naturally, I gotta wonder, will we ever see him take off all 4 and maybe even go super sometime in the future? It's your move, Sonic Team. Make it happen.